live on Facebook and we are live on YouTube. That was fast. That is, let's mute myself there. All right. Custom live streaming. Cool. And nobody's joined. All right, here we go.
The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
It's actually pretty cool opening music. It's growing on me over time. I still miss We Need a Hero, but everybody hated it, so I moved on from that. Hey everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this post-Thanksgiving weekend. I hope you're all recovering from all that food. I know I have recovered. I'm hungry again. That's didn't happen for a few hours there. Today we're doing our monthly contributor hangout. We've got Jennifer and Jim on. Wouldn't be surprised if a couple more people joined us, but we'll see if they do. I also have a bunch of questions that were submitted in writing, so we'll go over some of those. And then, as always, we'll take some super chat questions. Although, you know, you better put some real dollars behind them if you want to supersede, you know, these guys here, because they've contributed quite a bit to the show. All right. Hi Jim. Hi Jennifer. How you doing?
Hello, hello. Doing well.
Good. You all have a good Thanksgiving?
Fat and happy, but what's new?
Okay, Jennifer, why don't you get us started with if you have a question?
Do you think the words radical and extremist mean somewhat the same thing? And why do you think they're usually used in the pejorative sense?
Well, they're used in a pejorative sense because I think that any view of that you're consistent with your ideas, that you're principled through and through, any indication of that is a negative. People, we live in a society that is dominantly pragmatist, where pragmatism really dominates every aspect of the culture. The idea of thinking in principle is really thought of as silly, as not practical, not connected to reality, really detached. So you know, so anything that smacks of I'm principled or I'm consistent is viewed negatively. Now, so Ayn Rand has a whole essay about extremism, right? Because this is during the Goldwater campaign, and Goldwater was smeared as an extremist, and she said extremism is, of course, a package deal. It takes people who are consistent with their ideas, who have principles and live up to those principles, and basically nuts, who are crazy, who want to blow up buildings, who want to do insane things, and it lumps them into the same concept, extreme. And she, you know, so she condemns, she says it's this package deal and we shouldn't really use it in that sense. And it's a way to undercut the people who are consistent, undercut principles, undercut the principle. I think radical's a little different. And in the sense that I think radical hasn't been used as much as a package deal. So I like using radical. I think radical, much more than extreme, because extreme of what, right? Extreme defender of individual rights, or extreme defender of Islam, or extreme defender of nihilism, or what is it? Or just extremely, you know, nihilistic, or just radical suggests basic principles. It suggests some thought out set of ideas that is significantly different and challenging to the status quo. And it doesn't have the same, I think, connotation as it's extreme, it's kind of wacky, it's out there. Radical just means
different than the status quo and principled, based on a different foundation than what exists in the world out there. So I use radical a lot. Leonard, I think, for years called himself a radical for capitalism. I think when he did his radio show, I've used radical for capitalism or radical for.
Ayn Rand herself called herself a radical.
Yep.
And when she did, like with many of the things that she said, I'm like, okay, that's surprising, but that makes sense. I hadn't thought of it before. Somebody here in the super chat even says extremism is an anti-concept.
Yeah, that's what she called an anti-concept, because it doesn't really aggregate together anything that fits together. It's meant to undercut. It's meant to destroy. It's meant to destroy the legitimate, and the legitimate is, of course, the principled stand, let's say, or semi-principled stand that somebody like Goldwater took at the time. Now, Goldwater did say in his famous speech at the Republican National Convention, he did say extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And that's a great line for a one-liner for a speech. But I do think that extremism, as used in the culture, is as Ayn Rand defined it, an anti-concept, and we shouldn't use it. It's again meant to undercut what he's trying to say, which is defense of liberty. Radical, on the other hand, I think is a good concept, relates to fundamental ideas and relates to different than the status quo, different than the conventional, and that we certainly are.
And funny enough, it speaks in the language that leftists like. They like the word radical.
Yep. And that's right. All right, good, Jim. And we've been joined by John, so we'll get to John in a minute. Go ahead, Jim.
And John, I don't see your video feed. I don't know if you have it on. I don't have as cool of a question as Jennifer did. I apologize, but I have a little bit of an observation. Something occurred to me a few weeks ago. I'm a bit of an amateur writer myself, and I like writing science fiction. And it occurred to me that both Atlas Shrugged and Anthem can be technically classified as dystopian science fiction. In both cases, you have futuristic technology. Well, in the case of Anthem, it's truly dystopian. All of technology is broken down. Culture, economy, governance is all broken down to a medieval state. And you have a rediscovery of ancient technologies. I'll leave it at that. But in the case of Atlas Shrugged, you have John Galt, who's invented these practically magical technologies that make possible, they're plot devices that make possible the kind of revolution that is described in it. And it was a moment when I realized that it's sci-fi, dystopian sci-fi, without the usual hard leftism of typical dystopian sci-fi.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Although I don't know what the definition of sci-fi is technically, so I'm not, literature is not my field, and
I'll just give a loose definition.
I'm not sure Atlas fits in the sense that it's usually placed in the future, although I guess it doesn't have to be like a what do you call that? A Man in a High Castle, which I only watched, I think, the first season, would be sci-fi, but it's not set in the future, so it's set in an alternative universe. So I guess, go ahead.
To take a similar example, if you look at A Scanner Darkly, that was a really interesting film based on a Philip K. Dick novel. Obviously, very dystopian in his thinking, but it's set. I think even the opening explanation says a few years from now, and it's meant to be very contemporary, but there are technologies that are very sinister, and they're meant to be. They could already exist now, and you just don't know about it.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I think that they both qualify, and but I do think quite a bit of, maybe I'm wrong, but quite a bit of science fiction is kind of libertarian, free market.
Some is, not always. I would say. Right? I would say that most of the science fiction that I've seen from the late 20th century and into this century have been very, very left in orientation. They're they are in effect utopian by virtue of their dystopian views. They almost always present capitalists as the bad guys. I mean, Blade Runner is the quintessential example.
Yep. I guess I got stuck on Robert Heinlein and never really went anywhere from there in my science fiction.
Oh, Heinlein wrote some really interesting stuff, and I it's definitely worth looking at. But for what it's worth, I really love the ending, and I'll apologize. Cover your ears if you haven't gotten to the end of the what's that series with the young girl who's the archer in the arena?
Hunger Games.
Hunger Games. The very end. Close your ears if you don't want to hear this, but in the end, Katniss Everdeen realizes that the people who are presented as the good guys, the guys who are ousted, are really the flip side. They're communist Nazis versus the overt Nazis. And instead of killing the now captive Hitler of her own world, she chooses to kill the commie Hitler.
So is that in the movie as well?
Yes, it is.
I guess I don't remember. I watched the movies. I didn't I didn't read the books.
Oh, I think it puzzles a lot of people. Like, why didn't she kill Snow? Snow is obviously the bad guy. Why did she kill the leader of District 13? And the reason is simply she realized that District 13 is just as bad as as the rest of Pan Am.
Yep. All right, Jonathan has joined us with his dog. Oh, you're muted. Let me unmute you.
Oh,
there. Now we can hear you.
hi. Great to be with you, Yaron.
Hey.
I have a question.
You guys look very comfortable.
On a lecture you gave, I believe at an OCon, you were asked about children, and you were talking about your perspectives on having children. And Harry Binswanger was there, and you remarked to remind you to tell a story about Harry and children at one point. I don't know if you remember that at all.
I do, but I shouldn't tell the story. I mean, I shouldn't have said it at the time, but without Harry's permission, I shouldn't. It's a story about Harry, and I don't know. Next question. Skip that one, Jonathan. Ask something else. You'll get me in trouble with Harry. I don't want to be in trouble with Harry.
Well, you just teased it so well. Remind me to ask you about Harry and children.
Next time I see Harry, I'll ask him if he doesn't mind me telling the story, and if he doesn't, I'll tell him.
Harry with Children. Isn't that a TV show?
Yeah. Go ahead, John.
All right, move on. I'll come back to me then. I was teed up on that one, so come back to me if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, Jennifer.
Do you think jails are to punish people and take you out of society, or do you think that do you think they should be doing rehab and job training and school and things like that?
Well, I think even the lumping up together of the first two is, those could be two separate things, right? So jails could be for three things, right? One, punish you. Two, take you out of society. Three, what was the third one? Rehab you. So my view is the number one reason to have jails is to punish. It's justice. You do something bad, you got to get something bad needs to be done to you, right? So it's an issue of justice. Second, it's an issue of taking you out of society because you're dangerous, and if you've shown a willingness to violate rights, you could do it again. So I don't think there should be rehab in jails. I don't think taxpayers should pay for that. I don't think that's the job of jails. I don't think there's any evidence necessarily. I don't know the evidence about whether it works or not, but I think the purpose of jails is and I think we're way too lenient on violent criminals. Now, granted, I think most people in jail today probably shouldn't be in jail because most of the stuff is victimless crimes.
Yeah, drugs.
So many of the things are victimless crimes. So I think that's really important to note. But beyond that, I think we're way too lenient on violent criminals. I think violent crime should be in a civilized society unthinkable, and the consequences of engaging in violent crime should be horrific. and should be both an incentive not to commit the crime, but also clear sense of justice, clear sense of punishment. And rehab is something that is your responsibility. It's not something that the state, taxpayers, people engage in that. You could have rehab nonprofits, you could have philanthropies that do rehab, and they could go to jails and do rehab. And so you could have ways in which rehab gets done in jail. It's just not the job of government to do the rehab. It's just, job of government is to protect individual rights, and to put away criminals. It's not to rehabilitate. It's not to provide psychological. Once you allow for that, you open up the door for the welfare state.
Thank you.
All right, Jim.
So this is, again, a bit of a jumbled question and a big one. Recently in one of your videos, and this might have been from a few years back, in response to a question, you acknowledged that some people who identify as objectivists are, quote, obnoxious. And I had to agree with that point. Much as I consider myself, student of objectivism, loosely an objectivist and so forth, I got to admit, I've been browbeaten at times in the past by objectivists who I tend to think that they mean well, they're smart, they have good ideas, but they're terribly intolerant of imperfection. And the broad question here is, I'm going to try to formulate this as I'm talking, long-term versus short-term. When you speak about, say, Donald Trump, I think that you are cognizant of the fact that you're speaking to the future, and whatever positive credit you might give him now will be almost meaningless a few years from now. And so you need to make the most principled statement that you can. And more broadly, so should all of us. We should be speaking from principle as much as possible. And yet, and here's kind of the important part, we have to deal with what we have today. When I think about the work that you do, and I know you kind of object a little bit to even my own characterization a few months back of you as being the face of objectivism, but I think that the way that you've become one of the most visible advocates of objectivism is by meeting people where they are. You're willing to say, I disagree, but you're willing to meet with them. And like we were talking about before the show, it seems you win. So I guess to package this up, short-term versus long-term and meeting people where they are.
So I'm not sure how this connects to objectivists being obnoxious. Just make that connection for me.
I apologize. I think that you were, how is it connected, or are you asking me to?
Connected?
Because when people who identify with objectivism are being obnoxious, usually what they are doing, in my experience, is they're nitpicking. They can see you have the broad strokes of somebody who agrees with Ayn Rand and her thinking, but you disagree on some small point, and therefore, screw you, get out of here.
And they're also nitpicking with people who are not objectivists. That is, the way they approach the culture is not, here, I've got some interesting ideas, let's debate them. Here, I've got the truth. I've got this big hammer. Let me pound it over your head until you succumb to it. And if you don't, you're immoral and go away. And
you're stupid, which is a great way to get people to believe in what you believe.
And I'm sure I was like that when I was young. I mean, I think
me too.
When I was in my late teens, early 20s, I was to some extent like that. I don't think I was quite as bad as some people. But and I think that's wrong, but unsurprising. First of all, most people's early understanding of objectivism is rationalistic. It's not tied to reality. It's not tied to concretes. It's not tied to experience. Most of us, when we're 16, 17, 18, read Atlas Shrugged, we don't have the experience to fully tie down her ideas to reality. We kind of get them at the abstract level, And it takes years and years and years to fully tie down the philosophy to reality and get it at a level that's not rationalistic. So we hold these ideas rationalistically, which means we don't really know the ideas. So to some extent, we're pretending to ourselves to know them. And then, we expect everybody else to get them as floating abstractions, just like we did to some extent, right? So it's somewhat natural that when you're young, you would do that because you don't know any other way. Some people, unfortunately, never outgrow it. But there is a difference, I think, between, and maybe this relates to your question, being obnoxious and being principled and unwavering.
Absolutely. I don't want to conflate the two. I mean, I loved the few cases that we have recorded of Ayn Rand in interviews, radio or television. She would say some outrageous things, and yet she wasn't, in my opinion, she wasn't really being obnoxious. She was not lording over people, even when she was being very judgmental.
Yep. No, absolutely. And so I think with regard to the short run, long term, I don't think there's a real dichotomy between the two. That is, I think you have to be principled in the short run and the long run. I think you have to call things the way they are, based on those principles. Who you vote for is a secondary issue to what you call out. That is, I'm fine with people. I disagree with them, but I'm fine with people who say Donald Trump's an awful president. He's going to do real damage long-term to the United States. It's a disaster. It's terrible. But, he's better than alternative, and I'll vote for him. I think they're wrong for the most part. It depends who the alternative is going to be next time. But that's a reasonable position to have. It's something you can have a debate with versus how could you dare attack Donald Trump? You're playing into the hands of the left. The left is the enemy. Anybody we elect who's anti-left is okay. That is total pragmatism, total abandonment of principle and ideas, and abandoning the long term. But it also is abandoning the short term, because in the short term you still get Donald Trump. So it's not like there's some good that you're going to get in the short term by abandoning the long term. That actually doesn't happen, with very few exceptions. Usually you suffer in the short term when you do things that are not good for you in the long run. Right?
Well, I was even surprised.
Chocolate being the exception. Chocolate, maybe alcohol, maybe drugs being the exception. But it really depends on who you are, right? So if you're well integrated, and this is an interesting point, actually. And it goes back to it relates to somewhat to Ben Shapiro's, if you remember Ben Shapiro's thing about the woman at the bar, right? A selfish person goes with a woman at the bar, right? Because you want sex. So if you're a well-integrated person, right? If your values are well integrated, if your ideas are integrated, if your emotions and your ideas are well integrated, then you have no desire for the woman at the bar. Right? It's not something you want and then say, oh, but it's bad for me long term. Oh, but I've got a wife at home. Oh, I've got these other things I have to think long term. No, it never occurs to you to want it, because it's fully integrated. Your emotions are going with you. Your sexual preferences or desires are consistent with everything else that's going on. So you don't have that. And I think the same thing, for example, is with drugs and all these other things. I have no desire for the cocaine. It's not something where I say, oh, but I know it's bad for me. That's already integrated. It's already gone. So the whole trade-off between short-term and long-term is overemphasized, overplayed. If you integrate your long-term values and your virtues properly, and you integrate them into your life, then the I does not have a pull on you.
I should have pointed my question a little bit more when I was asking about short-term versus long-term thinking. I was very narrowly thinking about how one talks to other people, especially people with radically different ideas. And it's tempting to take what I would consider a short-sighted long view, where you just attack everything that doesn't comport with your ideas. And to me, that's a mistake.
I think it's a huge mistake. I think a large extent, it depends on what your purpose in talking to them. If you want to talk to somebody and show how stupid they are and how smart you are, then attack them and put them down. If you want to engage with them and really discuss ideas with them, then engage with them and discuss ideas with them for whatever reason, because you enjoy it or because you're hoping to convince them. If you've got an audience and you're trying to get the audience to come to your side, then sometimes I don't think it almost ever is a good idea just to put the other party down. Why did you accept the interview if your purpose is to put the other party down? You can be radical in how you present your ideas, without insulting the other party. So if your goal is the audience, then figure out what you think will connect best with the audience to get you on your side, and use that as strategy. If you think that the best way to get the audience on your side is to put the other party down, then put the other party down. But I doubt that that's ever a good strategy. And I'm not saying water your own ideas down. You can be radical, but you can be radical, consistent, say radical things politely and nicely without accusing the other side. Oh, and we objectivists, we think we have the ultimate insights. Oh, you're just a Kantian. Most people view that as a compliment, not as a criticism, telling people. I mean, I think the model is, and I don't like tooting my horn too much, is how I engage with Ben Shapiro. I didn't go in there to show that Ben Shapiro is an idiot. First of all, he's not, or that his ideas are evil. I went in to use his platform to express objectivist ideas, and not to put him down, but to raise up us. And I think I did it in a polite way without moderating anything I said. I didn't say anything that was not true and not radical.
I think you did a perfect job there, and he gave you the perfect opportunity. I would say further, almost every time you go and you give a lecture to a group, your format seems to always be start by meeting people where they are. Here's what you think you already know about the world. Here are the problems you see. Let me talk for maybe a third to a half of the time about the specific issue. And then now that I've paved the way, let me tell you how the fundamental ideas of the world contribute to this. And I think that's a perfect format. And that's meeting people where they are.
Yep, I agree. I agree. That's exactly what good communication is. It's knowing the context of your audience and addressing their context, meeting them where they are. I mean, some of the stuff I say early on is still moving them forward. Like when I talk about the economic outcomes of capitalism, they don't quite realize that, but it's relatively simple and it's not radical. It's the morality that's radical. And I try to get to the morality over time. I try to get them to there rather than starting off with egoism. That I think that's too hard for them. It's too hard for them to get. All right, Jonathan. Oh, you're muted again. I muted you. Unmute. All right,
Okay.
you gone.
Great to be with you. And while you were traveling, I enjoyed so much of what you posted in terms of some of your other lectures, in particular, some of the lectures from Poland I thought were really interesting and illuminating. And, just want to thank you for all the work you do spreading my ideas all over the world and the intellectual ammunition you provide me with all the time. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
A little bit
I enjoyed doing it.
non-philosophical, but I'm wondering if you have any New Year's, excuse me, if you have any New Year's traditions that you like to engage in terms of, I don't know, whether it be resolutions or celebrations, anything you like to do on New Year's.
I mean, I don't have a tradition in the sense that every year is the same. I mean, I definitely like to celebrate it. I definitely think New Year is a great time to contemplate where you are and where you're going. And, I don't do formal resolutions. I don't write them down. I know some people do. Alex Epstein has this whole process that he recommends to people in terms of resolutions. So I don't do that. But I do use it as a period to just think about the year, think about what was good, what was not so good, and then think about what I want to do, do my kind of 5-10 year plan and boil it down to a 1 year plan, what I want to achieve in the following year. I usually do it in my head. I don't put it down on paper, but that's typically good enough. And I have to say, I think I said this in my Thanksgiving show. I find the whole period between Thanksgiving and New Year to be a great time for that kind of contemplation. It's usually at a little slower business-wise. People expect less during this period. It's a little bit more relaxed, and it's a good time to do a lot of thinking about where you are and where you want to go. So I definitely use New Year's as that, because once New Year's over, you get right back into the fast pace. Everything starts picking up as soon as New Year's over. Then I like celebrating. I like the fireworks. I have to say, in our condo in Puerto Rico, they actually shoot the fireworks right underneath the condo, so right below us. So we're on the 7th floor. I know it's not like Jonathan's like 67th floor or something in Chicago, but we're on the 7th floor, and the fireworks are like eye level, which is so cool. So we got on the balcony, and the fireworks is just right. You can almost touch them right in front of us, and it's so we love doing that. Like to have a good nice meal, and then I usually spend the day relaxing. So I don't embrace Ayn Rand's thing of you do what you want to do for the rest of the day. You do it on New Year's, because I do so many different things. It would be hard to do it on New Year's. Let me unmute you. Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
What is that? I don't know. What is that?
Oh, you're not familiar with that? So Ayn Rand's tradition on New Year's was during the first to write. Do a little bit of writing, not a full day, but do a little bit of writing. In a sense, to do in New Year's what you are planning to do for the rest of the year. To get the year in motion, if you will. And to start it out right. So she did that. I can't sure if Lena does that as well, but she talked about that. So she definitely does it. She definitely did it. All right, let me take one of these questions that was sent in, and then Vasagad now starting to pile up some super chat questions. And I did want to thank Murphy for his very generous super chat contributions. Thank you, Murphy. All right, let's see. John asks, the Gates Foundation has recently been criticized for its charitable work because it only serves those charities the Gates Foundation deems appropriate versus those the government and society in general deem most appropriate, thus supporting the idea that a wealth tax should be imposed on billionaires. Is this not a perfect real-world example of a sanction of the victim, as Bill Gates supports this moral principle when he says, quote, I believe that with great wealth comes great responsibility to give back to society, a responsibility to see that those resources are put to work in the best possible way to help those most in need. All right, the question is, there's so many things to say about this. It is so disgusting. So yes, it's definitely a sanction of the victim. Gates is basically sanctioning his destroyer, sanctioning the people who condemn him morally by arguing that his responsibility is to give money to those in need and help those most in need. But of course, Gates has too much self-esteem. I have too much respect for Gates. And he has too much respect for himself. Gates and most of these Silicon Valley guys have way too much self-esteem to think that somebody else can make a decision in terms of who is most in need and how to help them, make a decision better than they can. So Gates says, yeah, it's my responsibility, but I'm not letting you make the decision of where to put the money. I'll make the decision where to put the money, because Gates is this mixture of like an egoistic self-esteem, confidence in his own ability, positive view of the future, a doer, a creator, a builder, a maker, a productive genius. And altruism. He's got this mixture in him. And there's altruistic duty. And altruistic duty manifests itself more than anything in his professed beliefs and actions. I don't know how much he actually deep down believes it, but I don't know how much he thinks he needs to believe it. I don't know how deep it goes. But
I
it's,
really think that he, in his early career at Microsoft, just got pummeled nonstop by the left, and he kind of caved, and I think he kind of gave into the social pressure.
I think he did, but you know, his parents, if you read about him, his parents are pretty pretty altruistic. I think his wife is fairly religious and altruistic, and so there's a whole universe around him. It's not just the pounding of the left. So he's a mixed case, but this is clearly, so the left hates the idea that individual people get to decide what to do with their money and get to decide what's good for society and what's good for the needy. They want the power to do those things for them. Who are they? So what the left hates about Gates is his self-esteem. What the left hates about Bill Gates is his virtue, is the one thing that's good about him, that confidence, that self-esteem, the fact that he does want to actually, if he's going to contribute, he wants to do it himself and make those decisions by himself.
Let me add a quick little piece of historical context too. Since as a software engineer, I paid a lot of attention to Microsoft and Gates along the way. He actually wrote a decent autobiography many years ago too. Anyway, I think Road Ahead or something. Anyway, one aspect that he is very much remembered for in the tech community is early on, he argued against the prevailing view in kind of the mainframe world that software is free. It just comes with, and you pay for the hardware. He said on the flip side, because remember, they were selling software, they weren't selling hardware. So he at conferences and certain public venues said very vociferously that people should pay for software. And this really got under the skin of a lot of leftist leaning programmers.
Yeah, doesn't surprise me. No, I like Gates. I mean, and the more I read about him, the more I like him. And it's sad. The thing I see in him is a certain tragedy that he's bought into this. And yes, he's definitely sanctioning this sanction of the victim. He is the victim of this leftist propaganda. He is the victim of altruism. And more than anything, it's the spiritual cost that he's paying. It's the fact that he feels guilty. It's the fact that he has to say things like this and feel this responsibility on his shoulders. That's the price that he's paying more than anything else, more than the taxes, more than anything else. It's this guilt, and it's a horrible example of sanction of the victim. All right, I'll do one more quick one here. What is the difference between a PhD in economics and a PhD in finance? Two different fields. Finance is applied economics, but because most economics doesn't deal with the real world and doesn't deal with the micro, with how actual firms behave and what happens at the micro level of an economy. Finance, to some extent, has had to come up with its own economic principles to guide it. But finance is also unhealthy because it still relies on certain economic and philosophical principles that have corrupted it, just like economics has been corrupted. But there are two different fields. One is a more practical field. Finance is practical. It's more oriented towards reality at the and the firm level, at the market level, at the actual production trade level. Economics does a lot more macro, and even the micro tends to be a lot more abstract. And not indeed, I think economics suffers from not dealing at the micro level, at the level of the structure of markets and businesses and how they interact and so on. So the Austrians are a lot better at that than anybody else. And most economics, Austrian economics is micro. There's very little macro. And in a free market, you don't really need macro in a sense that you're not trying to shape an economy. You just try, in a sense, in a free market, if you get away from all the macro, then there's a much bigger convergence between economics and finance, economics, and business more broadly. So business schools and economics would not be that separate. They would be very much aligned, whereas today they're completely separate fields. They sit in some different parts of the university, because business is the application of economics, but really business is just an aspect of economics. And most of economics should be studying business. Economics should be the study of production or trade. All right, let's do another round, and then I'll do some super chat questions. Jennifer.
Do you think, especially someone just learning objectivism, could get thinking for yourself and subjectivism confused?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's an easy mistake to make, and particularly when you're just starting out and you don't quite get what being an egoist means and what being self-interested means, and the other thing that's very hard to get. It's not easy at all, even for advanced objectivists. I think, what does objectivity mean? What does it mean to be objective? Is very hard, and it's very confusing. What does it mean to be selfish, or what does it mean, and confuse that with being a subject or subjectivity. You have to really understand what objective values mean, and it's not easy. It's not easy. I mean, we're brought up with these two ideas, right? Values either subjective or they're intrinsic. And when objectivists say objective, most people think that means intrinsic, because the only alternative to subjective they can imagine is intrinsic, right? And generally, I talked about this with Ankar when we talked last time. People think in dualities, right? They think in terms of subjective, intrinsic. They think in terms of left and right, Republican, Democrat in the politics. It's hard for them to think that there's an alternative, that there's something more than that. And Ayn Rand is a real innovator here. I mean, a real philosophical innovator. The whole idea of objectivity, the way Ayn Rand presents it, is different than anything that others have described in the past. Almost all philosophers in the past have been both explicitly and implicitly either subjectivist or intrinsicists. Some might have been implicitly objectivist, but they couldn't develop an epistemology of objectivity. And that's what Ayn Rand did. And that's probably philosophically probably her greatest contribution, is that epistemology of objectivity, which is, and that's why it's so hard for people, because they've never heard anything like it. And for philosophers, it's the hardest because they are so conditioned to this dichotomy.
Thank you.
Sure. Jim.
I kind of want to echo a question that I see in the super chat here. Alex Levering asks roughly if there's a difference between left versus right dictatorship. And something you said, I think very recently, you said that communism, certainly in its purest form, certainly Stalin style, Stalinist communism, we can certainly lump the dictator of North Korea into this, is morally identical to fascism. And I want to suggest that we need to start hammering this point that deep down, because of where it all goes, and I think Ayn Rand argued this as well, communism leads to exactly the same tyranny as fascism. We need to start calling communists fascists.
Well, I think it's confusing to call them fascists because there's a difference between the two. There's a sense in which that's right, but there's a difference between the two. I think we need to declare communism evil. I don't know if you saw my latest interview with Vidhu in the UK. And I said to him, if you're over 25 and you're a communist, you're evil. And he was like, whoa, how can you say that? And people don't get it. But if I said, if you're over 25 and you're a Nazi, you're evil, they would have said, yeah, of course. And we have to say communism and Nazism are the same thing from a moral perspective. They might have different ways in which that evil is expressed, but they're the same thing from a moral evaluation perspective.
And arguably the outcome is the same.
Yes, and the outcome is death and destruction. All right. Let me just, oops, did I delete the question?
It's the second question that was paid for.
Yeah, but let's see if I can find it. Okay. Could you explain the difference between right versus left-wing dictatorship? Is there one? Also, what does it mean to have power in today's world? I mean, the difference is that the one is a complete elevation of the state above property rights. So there's no semblance of property rights, right? There's no semblance of an individual. There's nothing. Everything is the collective. Everything must serve the collective in every single aspect. It doesn't pretend that there's any meaning to individual, any meaning to property rights. And that's communism. Communism, everything is owned by the state or by the collective, by the proletarian. And it is, whereas Nazism or fascism, there is this sense that, there's a role for property, right? They pretend you have property. They pretend you have choices. They pretend you're an individual. But of course, it's exactly the same as communism in the sense that you don't. But there's the pretense. There's the facade of it. And the integration, for the most part, in fascism is around the state, not around the proletariat, not around the workers, not around the needy, not around the people, but the state. So it's an even more abstract thing that you're supposed to sacrifice to. It's not people. It's not that group of people. It's the state. Of course, with the Nazis, it's the state as represented by the Aryan race, or as reflected in the Aryan race, or some integration of the two. And that's what makes, I think, Nazism not something that happens over and over again, because it's that form of racism, as Ayn Rand described. Racism is the most primitive form of all forms of collectivism, and therefore it's also the one that is hardest to sell on a mass scale like that, I think, in modern society. I think you could do it on small scale, but on a large scale, it's very difficult. The Nazis pulled it off in Germany, but they haven't really been able to pull it off anywhere else on a large scale. There's lots of racism at a local scale, but for whole people, tens of millions of people, to be racist to the extent that the Nazis were, and consistent to the extent the Nazis were, nobody's been able to do that because of how primitive and how barbaric and how it really is. And in that sense, it's more primitive than communism, because it's you can kind of get, okay, there are poor people here and they're working hard, and you can kind of get something there, but the race is nothing. It's zero. There's nothing there. What's the purpose of it? And I think that's this other question: how come communism rose all over the world, whereas Nazism only emerged in Germany and nowhere else? I think it's that. It's the fact that communism was a response to capitalism. Communism is a response to, once capitalism raises everybody's standard of living, there's this inequality, and there's some people that seemingly are working hard and are not getting rich, are not as rich as these others. And these others who are getting rich are seemingly not working hard and not doing anything seemingly productive, right? Again, seemingly, not real productive. So that it's got some, first of all, it's an experience that you get anywhere that's had a little bit of capitalism, and it has some seeming viability. It seems somewhat, in a crazy way, reasonable, right? Whereas the idea that we're a superior race and we should subjugate all other races to us, I mean, unless you're German, it doesn't, nobody, few think that. I mean, some people think.
Some African countries, there's a lot of that.
Yeah, and some tribes versus other tribes, but it's usually small, it's usually local, it's usually tribes slaughtering each other.
See that to some degree in Iraq as well.
It's some white people versus some, some others. In the Middle East, it's mostly about Islam. It's less about race. It's about the superiority of a religion, a set of ideas. It's just, you have to have achieved a lot as a nation, which is already is a mistake, right? Nations don't achieve anything, only individuals do. And then have the sick, collectivistic, barbaric, primitive inclination and buy into that, which only taking Kant seriously can get you to that point, and completely having, and anybody who's curious about this should read The Ominous Parallels. And I think it's just much rarer than an affinity to the workers. The other thing is most people are the workers, and you can see how you could instill envy in enough workers to rally them around a cause that supposedly will make them better off in some ways. So I think communism has more credibility with more people in more diverse cultures, in more diverse ethnic groups, and more diverse races than Nazis can possibly have, because it's so limited and unique. All right, on the super chat, you got to stop, because there's no way I'm going to be doing this until tomorrow if I answer all these questions. So we gotta slow down here. All right, so that's, I think I answered that. So the left and the right are basically the same at their purely collectivistic manifestation. They're both 100% totalitarian. They're both about sacrificing the individual to the collective. They choose different collectives, and they choose different political methodologies to use, and different utopias to lead people towards, different utopias to imagine, right?
And Ayn Rand tried to popularize the term statist. It's a shame it never really took off outside of
Well,
us.
and I still use statist, and I think everybody should use statist. They're all statists. And I think the middle is statist too. That's the other thing. So on the spectrum, there's statists and capitalists. And the middle is less statist than communism and fascism, but they're still statists, right? I mean, the Republicans, even the moderate Republicans, or the moderate Democrats, are still statists. They're just less statist than the more consistent Republicans, collectivists, and democratic collectivists. So both communism and Nazism are forms of statism. There's a sense in which they're forms of socialism, but I think that just confuses things. Ayn Rand said that at some point, but she also differentiated between fascism and socialism. So I think it's confusing. I like the idea of communism and fascism. Socialism leads to communism. Fascism and Nazism on the other spectrum, but they're all the same. They're all forms of statism. And we're capitalists, individualists, which are the opposite. So it's collectivism versus individualism, statism versus
Food for thought here, though. Would you argue at this point that the Chinese Communist Party is fascist, or are they really communist still?
Yeah, I mean, I've argued repeatedly that they're fascists. I don't think they're communists at all. I think they're purely fascists. And maybe some of them still think, when they read certain communists that they're communists, but they're not. They're fascists. They're about control. They're about power. They're about controlling the Chinese people. They're about maintaining the party's rule. And the way they've implemented it is not by the state owning the means of production. Indeed, I mean, as we talk and as this regime is becoming worse and worse, yet at the same time, they're doing massive private property reform where they're increasing property rights in China right now, while restricting other rights. So, I mean, China is this mixture constantly trying to give people as much illusion of property rights as possible for them to produce, so that the so-called Communist Party, the Fascist Party, the Statist Party can continue to rule over them and keep people rich. Because the thing they're really, really afraid of is that if the economy plummets, then there'll be a revolution. And there's always been a revolution in China. China's gone through over and over and over in its history: consolidation of power, revolution, breakup of power, consolidation, breakup, and that's what scares them. And they're just like an emperor who's doing anything they can to sustain power. And they're not communist in their means or in the ideology. There's just no communists in China anymore. Even if they use the rhetoric of Mao or they use the rhetoric of certain communists in order to convince people that they're still the Communist Party because they get their moral authority from being communist. Are socialists from a moral perspective like Nazis? Well, no, not in the sense of, it depends what you mean by socialists. I mean, there are all kinds of socialists, but to the extent that they're certainly morally evil. The more consistent they are, the more they become communists. And then they are on the same par as Nazis. But, I mean, socialism is an evil ideology. It just hasn't manifested itself in quite as obvious a way with as many obvious deaths and destruction as communism has. So they're mildly can be innocent, although I think very few of them are. Whereas communism, you cannot be innocent about. They are down and out evil, no matter what age they are. Socialism, I give them a little bit more leeway. But yeah, from our perspective, it's evil, if not quite at the same level as Nazis and communists. All right, let me just see. Are most leftist philosophers Marxist to the core or just mildly on socialist spectrum? It depends. I think a lot of leftist professors are not Marxists at all. I don't like the term cultural Marxism. I think it gives them too much credit. Marx built a whole theory and had a rationale for things. It's all wrong. It's evasive. It's evil. It's bad. But he had a theory. I think a lot of these people, postmodernism, there's no theory there. It's just, to a large extent, it's the negation of theory. It's the negation of knowledge. It's the negation of truth. It's a negation of reality. It's a negation. And to call them Marxists is to give them too much credit. They're nihilists. And as nihilists, they don't even deserve the Marxists. So some of these professors are just nihilists. Some of them are mildly socialists. And some of them are through and through Marxist. Now, I find that a lot of professors, even on the right, have been influenced by Marx. That is, Marx has had such a strong influence on people that just the fact that we talk about classes in the way that we do. There's a middle class, and the middle class is shrinking or growing, and there's a working class and a lower class. That's Marx. That's Marx's influence on the culture. I try to avoid that. I know I do it sometimes because it's hard to in this world, but that's a Marxist influence. There are no such thing as classes. And class assumes that you're stuck there. It assumes a certain statusm. It assumes you're born into a class and you must stay there. And people think in those terms, and it gets integrated into their psychology and into their epistemology. So I think that the culture is infused with Marxist terminology and Marxist influences, whether people are explicitly Marxist or study Marx, advocate for Marx's idea. There are not that many pure Marxists out there anymore. Again, they're nihilists. They're people who picked up certain things from Marx. And then there are people who are, just nihilists, which I think is a lot of them. A lot of the more crazy people on the left are just nihilists.
I think that's becoming more prevalent too, the just pure nihilism. I guess I didn't take it seriously when I was growing up, and I don't think I heard much of it, but I think you're right. I think more and more people are more interested in tearing down than in even idealizing a better world.
I think it's this generation. I mean, again, Marx had a utopia that he was striving towards. It wasn't, you could say his motivation might have been nihilistic, but he presented a vision. And you could be, I guess, in the late 19th century, a passionate communist. Look at, what's his name? Ayn Rand has a communist as a sympathetic character, right? In We the Living. And because you could imagine, it's only when you see the consequences, it's unthinkable, right? But you can imagine, because Marx presents a utopia. And if you think about Tsarist Russia, which is awful. If you're working class, if you're a worker, or if you're a peasant, it's awful to be under the czar. It's awful to have aristocrats. It's awful to have kings. You can see why there's an attraction to communism. This is why I think it's been successful in so many places. But once you realize what it actually entails, it requires massive evasion to continue to be, or evil intent to continue to be a communist. So, yeah, Marx has something to strive towards. Most of these people have nothing. The whole intersectionality stuff is pure nihilism. There's no goal. There's no color blindness at the end of the rainbow. It's pure us versus them racial warfare with
Eternal.
nothing to be achieved by it. No goal to be attained other than the crushing of anybody who has any kind of self-esteem, who rises up above, and succeeds in anything in life. All right, Jonathan, let me unmute you. Wait, let me unmute you. What's that?
Can we switch to economics quickly?
Sure.
What do you say to those who point to the tariffs and say that all the disastrous predictions about higher prices and slowing economy as a result have not materialized?
I say they've all materialized, and worse, right? So the economy has slowed. The economy last year grew at, I don't know, something around 2%, which is like, if this was an Obama economy, people would be yelling and screaming about the low economic growth. But now the believers in economic growth, the people on the right, are saying, oh no, best economy we've ever had in America, which is bizarre. So the economy has slowed. Prices on particular goods have gone up. Tariffs were never a big enough issue. And by the way, he's never imposed the big tariffs, which he was supposed to do in December next month. We'll see if he does that. We was going to raise tariffs on all Chinese goods to 25 or 35%. So the big wave of tariffs hasn't come yet. Specific tariffs on specific goods like washing machines have been well documented as having significant increases in the prices of washing machines. That hasn't filtered into large-scale inflation, because inflation is not a tariff phenomena. Inflation is a monetary phenomena. So if you raise taxes on some goods, what happens is demand for, those prices on those goods might go up, but prices on other goods might go down because demand for them will go down. So, because you only have so much money, you can't buy everything you wanted to buy before. Now you're buying the washing machine at a higher price. You have less money to buy for other things, and everybody does. So there's reduced demand for certain products, and their prices go down. There's massive bankruptcies in the farm. The most bankruptcies of farms since 2011 under Obama. So the farming sector is suffering dramatically, significantly. Other stuff. And look, it's the unseen. It's all the stuff we wouldn't have had. It's all the cheap goods we don't have. And of course, I said all along, and I gave this economic explanation, but nobody seems to pay attention, right? What happens when you impose tariffs is that you're buying less goods from overseas. So there's fewer dollars going overseas. But the fact is that the reason there's a trade deficit is because the Chinese want dollars, because they want to invest in the United States. So if there's less the United States importing from China, then the Chinese still want more dollars. So what do? They go out and they buy the dollars with their local currency, which causes the dollar to go up and the local currency, in this case, the Chinese currency, to go down, which is exactly what we saw early on when the tariffs were imposed. It's reversed itself because since then, interest rates have gone down. Economics is hard. There's a lot of moving parts, and you have to follow it all. So the dollar went up in value. The dollar going up in value makes it cheaper for Americans to buy Chinese goods. So the stronger dollar undoes what the tariffs do. And therefore the quantity of dollars of stuff being bought from China has not changed. Indeed, the trade deficit is just as high today as when tariffs were imposed because of this phenomena, because of the change in currency value. So we're still importing huge amounts. It all depends on why did Donald Trump put the tariffs in place. If he put it in place to reduce the trade deficit, they're a massive failure because the trade deficit has not gone down. If he put it in place to negotiate some deal where China opens up its markets and protects intellectual property rights, hasn't happened yet. And I think we're going to get something of that. Some of that will happen because I think China was going to do it anyway. China has been reducing tariffs in China for 20, 30 years, has been instituting more and more US-style rule of law with regard to economics in China for decades. So that would be a continued trend. There is some talk about them increasing protection of property rights by 2025.
I think they've been cracking down in at least small ways on pirated videos and things.
Yeah. Well, they've been doing that for years, but now we're talking about high tech and stuff like that, which is the big complaint. So I think the tariffs have been unequivocally a failure. I think, yes, they have had negative economic consequences, both in terms of the economy growing slower, farms going out of business, manufacturers going out of business, and what was the other one? Anyway.
Trade deficit.
Yeah, and trade deficit not budging, although I don't care. Actually, who cares about trade deficits? I don't think they matter one way or the other.
Great answer. I might have to bug out a little early, but thank you once again. You're known for this and for all that you do.
Sure, sure. Were you going to say something else about the economy?
No, thank you so much.
Okay, good. All right, let's see. I'm going to run down these Super Chat questions quickly, and then that probably will be it. But let's see how many of these we can get through. What do you think of Nick Fuentes and these new alt-right tactics? I think they're barbarians. I think they are, I can't think of more insulting things. I mean, Nick Fuentes is a racist, anti-Semitic, I could swear, but I'm not going to. Anyway, he's pathetic. He's an idiot. He's 21 years old and people take him seriously. He knows nothing. And yet he has really rallied a bunch of young people around around this horrible cause of, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Nick Fuentes and this Make America Great, America First movement, his America First movement. Basically, it says Donald Trump is right, but he's not brave enough to put it in action. We are going to put it in action. And they go to events by people like Donald Trump's son, by Charlie Cook, by others, and they push them on their views. Justifiably, they push them. If you're going to be, it's like, if you're going to be a racist all the way. If you're going to have tariffs, be a protectionist all the way. If you're going to be if you don't believe in capitalism, let's not believe in capitalism all the way. So Nick Fuentes wants the Donald Trump supporters to be real fascists, not halfway, right? He wants them to go all the way anti-American. If you're going to, if you're going to be America First, then you have to hate Israel. Go all the way. Join us in hating Israel. If you really think that America should be a white Christian country, then go all the way and they don't say kick out the Jews, but they imply that. So it is a real neo-Nazi, movement trying to hide behind well-dressed, tie-wearing, slick hair, Nick Fuentes, who is presenting himself as a moderate fascist, but he is it. He's awful. He's terrible. The tactics, yeah, they get them a little bit of press, but at the end of the day, what are they gaining? Now, it's true. Nick Fuentes has a little bit more subscribers than I do on YouTube. Given the insanity of his ideas, it's a disgrace that he has any subscribers on YouTube. But given the tactics and how popular the tactics are, he should have many more subscribers than I do on YouTube. So go figure. I mean, I think he's a disgusting, horrible human being, and the ideas are awful, just awful. Okay, Capitalist Nick asked a quick question. What did I mean yesterday that many objectivists view David Kelly's book, Evidence of the Senses, was too rationalistic? It's too rationalistic. It's not concretized well. It's not connected to reality well. It's too floating abstraction. It's too unconnected to reality. Now, can I show that and give you examples? No. Last time I read Evidence of the Senses and didn't particularly like it was, like, I'm trying to do the math, but it was when it came out in the mid to late 80s. I haven't read it since. So I'm not going to try to prove that. But when I read it, and my impression of it, and the impression of some other pretty smart objectivists surrounding me, before the David Kelly split ever happened, was that it read too disconnected from reality. It read too rationalistically. Not enough examples, concretizations, bringing it back to reality in a logical sense. Not enough induction, too much deduction would be one way to think about it. Does someone have the right to be and stay homeless? In a sense, yes, you have a right to do what you want to do, but you can't be homeless in a capitalist country and live on my property. So you would have to find somebody who's willing to have you on the property. Otherwise, you'd go to jail for trespass. So in a purely capitalist economy, you would either live on the property that somebody allowed you to live on, or you would be in jail as a trespasser. All right, let's go back to the super chats. Don't ask any more super chat questions, please. I don't have time. All right. Does the non-aggression principle apply to the unborn child? Why do some libertarians oppose death penalty for guilty parties but oppose abortion? No, the non-aggression principle does not apply to the unborn child. And as I said in the past, there is no such thing as the non-aggression principle. There is the principle of individual rights. The principle of individual rights is not exactly the non-aggression principle. It's a principle that defines your freedom of action. It's a principle that says you are free to act on your own behalf, in seeking your own survival, in the pursuit of your own rational values, free of coercion, in pursuit of your happiness. It is, individual rights can only apply to individuals who are alive and separate from any other biological entity, and who might need help in order to survive, but are a functioning unit external to the mother, and have goals and have clear, even though it's not explicit, they have things that they need in order to survive as individual separate entities. A fetus is not a separate entity. As long as it is inside the mother, it is part of the mother, and therefore the mother, who is a separate entity, has the individual right to do as she pleases with her body. And therefore, no, there is no such thing as, first of all, there's no such thing as the non-aggression principle. It's a principle, it's a way for libertarians to take Ayn Rand's ideas around individual rights and come up with their own formulation. The principle cannot be divorced from the idea. The idea of non-aggression cannot be divorced from the idea of rights, from the idea of individual rights. And fetuses don't have individual rights. Why do some libertarians oppose death penalty for the guilty? Well, I don't know what libertarians do. I'm not a libertarian, but as an objectivist, I don't oppose the death penalty for guilty parties on a moral basis. I think it's completely moral to kill a murderer. I oppose it as a practical issue. I oppose it because there's a possibility that you'll be wrong about whether this person was a killer. And you cannot go back from killing somebody. So a death penalty is not something you can retract. You can't free the person. You can't, once you figure out what that somebody didn't do it, you can't make them alive again. So it's just a practical issue. If there's no question that the person did it, it's unequivocal. There's more than unreasonable doubt. There's no doubt, period. Then I'm fine with the death penalty. Fine with the death penalty. Look, a fetus is unique. There's no question a fetus is unique. It's just not an individual. It just has no rights. That's all. It has no rights. It is not a political entity. It's not an entity in society.
Can I ask the tough question here in your opinion? I've been a kind of a lifelong strong advocate. How about 2 seconds before?
It's 2 seconds before. So, once a woman goes into labor and there's a process in place to bring about this birth, then I think it's over. But up until the moment she goes into labor, it's still a potentiality. It's not an actuality. And I get why people object to that, but it's still not an individuated entity. In a free society, would you go to jail for selling drugs to minors? Potentially, yes. I mean, you'd have to define what drugs are and what is a minor. And I mean, the whole idea of law for children, for minors, and how it treats minors and how it excludes certain things from and with and parental consent and the extent to which the government oversees parents. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and I do not have all the answers. But generally, if drugs are outlawed, sale of drugs to minors is outlawed, then you would go to jail for selling them. Yes. And I think you should. But developing a legal code that encompasses all of that and what is and isn't allowed in terms of minors is not a simple task and needs some real work. Was Nietzsche a Kantian philosopher? I don't think so, but I don't know. You'd have to ask somebody who's an historian of philosophy. How come even though politically we get worse, technologically things keep getting better? Because of Dagny, if you've read Atlas Shrugged, because because the entrepreneurs are continuously working hard, overcoming regulations, overcoming restraints, overcoming bad economic policies, and doing it in spite of all the constraints, all the limitations, all the harassment that they get. So it's the heroic nature of entrepreneurs, and we still leave them with enough freedom at the margin to push our society forward technologically. And once we get rid of that, once we don't leave them enough margin, then in a sense it's all over. How come okay, that's what I just ended. Was altruism part of pre-Christian ancient Greece or Roman culture? No, I don't think so. Certainly not Greece, probably not Roman. Altruism was probably part of tribal societies in some tribes. You sacrifice to the tribe, you sacrifice to the gods, and it was a real sacrifice. By the time the Greeks are around, at least philosophically, and certainly at the height of Greek culture, it wasn't sacrifice. And with the Romans, I think Romans was like a cheap Greek, right, culture. Culturally, they kind of second-handed Greek culture. The Romans also didn't take the gods too seriously, and there wasn't real altruism in the sense of self-sacrifice for the state or for the gods. There probably was some, but it wasn't. I mean, the Christianity really formalizes this and really makes it a cultural phenomenon. Now, again, it existed at the tribal level pre-Greece, pre-Rome, and in other tribes around, where the sacrifice was to the gods, or the sacrifice was to particular, spirits or to the tribe itself. But the sophistication of altruism really comes together with Christianity.
I'm of the opinion that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans were a lot like contemporary times, in that there were some people who were religious in their thinking, and they were more likely to be altruistic in their thinking. and then there were the intelligentsia, and they were more what we would think of as atheistic and more individualistic. So
The difference is the intelligentsia today, the atheists today are all altruists and
Yeah.
committed altruists, but secular altruists. And the philosophers, the intellectuals of Greece are not altruists, not in the sacrificial sense of Christianity.
yeah, agreed. And I like your formulation and Rand's as well, that that the modern atheists who are socialist leaning have really just made a secular version of Christianity.
All right. Here's a weird, not a weird one, but just a personal one. I'm an objectivist, but I like being single and dating girls. Good. At least you're not one of those men going their own way or some nutty thing like that. Am I missing out by not getting into a long-term relationship? I have had them in the past, but I get bored. I mean, yeah, I think you are missing out in the end. Because I think a good long-term relationship, you wouldn't get bored. I think you just haven't found the right person to have a long-term relationship with. There's nothing wrong in dating in the meantime, but even in dating, hopefully you're dating people that you can respect, that you have positive, that you share values with, that you can love, or you can at least approach loving or liking or whatever. Otherwise that gets boring, right? And I would find dating boring. Meeting women after woman after woman, trying to get to know them, I mean, I'm sure the sex would be great because it would be new constantly, but that's very limiting in terms of what a relationship has the potential of being and what it can be. And even that, I think, would get boring, the new sex all the time. And there's a certain unbelievable advantage to having a partner over a long period of time, knowing what they like, them knowing what you like, developing sexually together, figuring out what you like together. All of that, there's massive benefits to that long-term relationship, even to the actual sex. I mean, it's funny because my wife, we were hugging, a couple of hours ago, just, while we were crossing paths in the living room. And she said, "Isn't it weird that after 37 years, we're not bored with each other yet?" And it is kind of weird, but that's what makes it amazing and phenomenal and wonderful that you can have that and not be bored. And if you get bored with somebody after dating them for a few months or after dating them for a couple of years, then either there's a problem with your relationship, or there's a problem with the person, or there's a problem with you. But you shouldn't keep doing it, or you shouldn't keep doing it without getting therapy. I don't know, figuring out what the deal is, finding out what the solution is.
I think you added in an important proviso that I think needs to be hammered. I don't think that we should extol long-term relationships for the sake of long-term relationships. If a relationship is bad, leave it.
Yeah, you gotta find great relationships and stick with the great relationship. And if it stops being great, fight for it to the extent that it's worth it, and fight for it for as long, because I think people give up way too easy. And people don't give up on other stuff way too easy, it seems, but they give up on relationships way too easy. But if I think fighting for a relationship is worth doing if the other person is worth it, and you have to make that decision about whether it's worth it or not, and fight for it. But at some point you have to, if you give up, you give up. Same with friendship. I think friendship is the same thing. I mean, long-term friendship is amazing, but sometimes you drift away and it's no good anymore. So it's no good anymore. And sometimes it's worth fighting for, and sometimes it isn't, and so on. So, all right. Why are New Yorkers so much more intellectual than the rest of America?
I think he meant to say pretentious.
Yeah, I mean,
just kidding. I lived in New York for a while.
Percentage of New Yorkers who are intellectual is high, but that's because that's true in cities generally, because the work done in cities tends to be more intellectual work. It tends to be work of the mind. It tends, at least in modern times, the outskirts tend to be where the factories are, and even further out tends to be where the farms are. So historically, intellectuals gravitate towards universities, which are typically in cities, or towards where there are other people, to culture. And that's where intellectuals tends to be, whether I mean, New Yorkers are more intellectual. They're also worse because being an intellectual today means being a leftist, and it's pretty bad. So it's not a compliment necessarily. I wish it was. I wish New York. I mean, New York is a vibrant. I mean, intellectuals like the arts. They want to be close to art. The intellectuals like to be with other intellectuals, so they aggregate together. So you'd expect them to be next to each other. And New York is the biggest, with the most opportunities, with the most possibilities of any city in the world, probably in terms of culture. So that's why. Why do you say free will is a biological phenomena, not a digital one? Thoughts are on Terminator 6. I don't know what that means. I don't know who Terminator 6 is. I don't know what that means, but
I think the recent Terminator movie.
oh, okay. I'll have to go see it. Is that 6? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, that's 6. Okay, Terminator 6. I haven't seen it yet. When I see it, I'll give you thoughts on it. Well, because free will. So here's the point, right? As far as we can tell, consciousness at any level, is a biological phenomenon. So a dog has huge awareness, even though a computer is a better chess player, has more, technically better horsepower, right? From a intellectual perspective, computers are not conscious. From everything that we observe in the world and in reality, consciousness is a biological phenomenon. It is a phenomena of, because life is, so let me start even before that. Life is a biological phenomenon. Life is not a 0-1 phenomenon. It's not a digital phenomenon. It's a biological phenomenon. Now, I know we think we can turn biology into zeros and ones. I'm not convinced of that at all, right? Chemistry is not physics, is not computer science. And neither one of those are biology. There's something unique about combining chemicals in a specific way that creates life, that then is something unique about life that doesn't exist in the chemicals. The combination is different than the chemicals, separately. Consciousness is a phenomenon of life, which is a phenomenon of biology. And free will is a phenomenon of consciousness, right? So you can't have consciousness without life, as far as I can see it. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see, there's no reason to believe so. And
I have to disagree with you on this pretty strongly, and I apologize. I am an amateur AI researcher, but I'm convinced that we are machines. We're wetware machines, but I don't see anything intrinsic about carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, water, and so forth that can't be replicated. Or I agree with you. We don't have anything resembling even say a dog's level of consciousness in today's machines, but I think we will eventually. Eventually human level, even beyond that. But I don't know. I don't think that there's a reason to say it's impossible.
See, I don't think that's possible. I don't think it'll ever happen. I think what'll happen is we'll create biological entities that have consciousness. We will create the biological entities, and we will embed computers in them, and we would embed computers in ourselves. So I think the future is a integration of the digital with the biological, but I think there's something distinct about biological phenomena. I can't prove that, and I certainly don't have the vocabulary to even try. So I'm gonna leave it at that.
I want to challenge you with a philosophical conundrum here.
Yeah.
And that is, if you could hypothetically predict what someone was going to do with 100% accuracy, would that negate free will? And my answer is no. Even if you can predict what someone's going to do, they still have free will.
See, I don't think you can ever predict what somebody else is going to do 100% because they have free will. So I do think free will negates our ability to make that prediction.
But I would argue that you are, in a way, surrendering to, say, Sam Harris's perspective that we that he creates a dichotomy of we're entirely predictable or we're entirely random. And I don't think we're
entirely
either.
random. Obviously, I don't think we're entirely random, but there is, and I don't think it's random. Choice is not random, but choice is not physically deterministic in a billiard board. It's not deterministic in the billiard board sense. It's not deterministic in the sense of it has a precursor, something that caused it. It causes itself. And how that works exactly, we don't know, but it is, and I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if there was I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not arguing for this. I'm just saying I wouldn't be surprised if we discovered that there's an element in reality, in the universe, that is not, doesn't function in the way that we understand physics to function today. And I'm not sure we know how physics functions today. That combined with the material creates consciousness. So I'm just saying, I don't know. And that wouldn't surprise me, because I think there's so much we don't know. And I think too many people who study physics think they know much more than they really know about what's really out there. And we don't really understand quantum phenomena fully. We don't really have a full explanation for it. And there's stuff going on even within the physics that we think we know that we don't really know. And then we know that in 100 years, we'll know stuff that we can't even imagine today about the physical world, and maybe about more than that, about consciousness. But anyway, that's me speculating. All right, is unemployment so low because of tax cuts and deregulation, or because of a lot of people dropped out of the workforce under Obama and aren't counted? So I think it's both. So unemployment is so low because tax cuts and deregulation have allowed the economy to grow, but at a slow pace. I mean, there's not been a lot of deregulation, and the tax cuts have not had a huge impact. And to a large extent, the tax cuts have not had as big of an impact on the economy because of the uncertainty created by Trump, because of tariffs. This goes back to Jonathan's question. Because of tariffs, and because he hasn't deregulated that much. So the corporate tax rate should have had a much more positive impact on the economy. And I think the reason they haven't is because of all the other junk that Trump has done, and the uncertainty around the election and all of that stuff. But unemployment was very low when Obama left office. People forget this. And then the economy kept growing and unemployment has gone down. But it's also true that the labor participation rate is nowhere near its peak, which was in 2000. Now, part of that is demographics. Part of that is just a baby boom generation retiring. But even when you take those things out, labor participation rates of people in their peak employment years, 24 to something, I can't remember, 57.
Something like what, 60%?
No, that's much higher than that. It's much higher than that. But it's still, even that is not as high as it was at its peak. It wasn't as high as it was before the 2008 recession. So now it's getting closer. So there's been an increase, but it's not peaked yet. So part of the unemployment is those people are not being counted. They're not, the kids in the basement, the Generation Z or whatever, playing video games, or the millennials who are still in their basement in their 30s, in their parents' basement, playing video games. They're not counted. Now, there's not a lot of those, but there's enough of those to skew the numbers. But look, unemployment rates are low right now. And another reason is I think I don't have the latest numbers, but I think immigration is down. So in a growing economy, immigration usually accelerates when the economy is growing. And that, brings in people who, and therefore unemployment of the locals might be a little higher. So no, I mean, it's not, it's primarily a consequence of the fact that the economy has grown and of the people who have not been counted. It's a combination of both of those, right? And then there's a bunch of people who are underemployed still, even in this economy. Everybody talked about it under Obama, the people who were only part-time, but wanted a full-time job. And when Obama was president, there were lots of people like on Fox News that constantly talked about that. Now nobody brings it up because, Trump cannot do any wrong. Have you ever encountered truly evil people in your life? How did you deal with them? How do you handle betrayal? Yes, I deal with them by getting as far away from them as possible, by keeping them out of my life, by distancing myself from them in every respect possible. That's how I dealt with them. How do you handle betrayal? That's tough. I mean, I've been betrayed several times in my life. Recently. Distancing myself from that person, having clarity in my own head about the betrayal, and just cutting them off, basically.
Don't be the victim, sanctioning the.
Yeah, and and sometimes it takes too long. Sometimes it takes me too long to figure it out and to cut the tie. Yeah, to let go, but you have to, and yeah, I mean, it depends on the level of betrayal. It becomes the depth of betrayal. It depends on what you expect. It depends on the type of relationship you had with them beforehand. So it depends on all of that. So but I handle it. I get very angry. I get really upset because I most of my relationships in life, I expect the best of people, and mostly it works out that way. I've had great relationships in life. I have friends for a long time. I have business partners who I've had for a very long time. I've obviously been with my wife for a very long time. So when somebody betrays me, I take it really badly, and it's very depressing, and it's disappointing, and you want to just distance yourself from the person and do as much damage control, because usually damage involved, as possible. All right, last question. If someone is drowning and I choose not to even call for help or throw them a lifesaver, does objectivism say that I cannot be criticized morally because someone else's needs has no claim on my life? Of course you can be criticized, right? I mean, a life is a value objectively. Other human life is a value, an objective value for all of us. And if it's about just calling for help or throwing them a life vest, of course you should do that. It's the moral thing to do. It's the right thing to do. A human being is a value. Now, this is a lifeboat scenario. Again, if it's you don't build a moral code around this. But yeah, I mean, being nice to people, being positive, helping people if it's not unbelievably out of, it doesn't take you out of your way, or if it's not a if it's not a sacrifice, and throwing somebody a lifesaver is not a sacrifice.
I think Ayn Rand would say you're not obliged to, but you'd be pretty heartless if you didn't.
Doesn't make you an evil person, but if you're not doing that, I look at you with suspicion. I look at you, I'm not going to be your friend. I don't like you. So you're definitely going to be criticized, even though I'm not going to say you're evil, right? So, and now, yeah, I mean, if you live in a world in which somebody is drowning every day, all around you, and throwing a lifesaver doesn't make any difference, then of course you don't have to throw a lifesaver. Because I can see somebody taking this and saying, well, there's a kid in Africa dying, and throwing a lifesaver is equivalent to writing him a $5 check, and you're not doing that, so can I criticize you? It's not the same. It's not the same thing, right? Again, this is an emergency. It's one-off. If it becomes everyday thing, then yeah, you can't throw lifesavers all day. You can't every step I take, there's a lifesaver. And now it's consuming a huge amount of your time. Now it really is a sacrifice.
I consider that a bit of a gotcha question that is motivated by ultimately, I'd say a very leftist belief that humans are evil and Scrooge McDucks at heart.
But it could be a question that where somebody's trying to clarify the boundaries of self-interest and what it actually.
Yeah, and I don't mean to say that that person's evil. It's just, but I think that a lot of people believe that at heart most humans are evil.
I hope that's not true, but I think this, to some extent they do, to some extent they don't. Certainly they don't behave that way. Most people behave in ways that suggest they think other people are rational and good people. Often when you ask them, they will say the opposite because they're good Christians, and they think we all have you know, what do you call it?
Original sin.
And all they're good leftists, and they all think that we're all selfish bastards. But I do think the way we behave is more indicative of our implicit assumptions, and most people behave in a way suggestive with goodwill towards other people, and in a way that suggests that they think other people are good and basically rational.
Well, and I think that this is a great opportunity to point out why Ayn Rand was a human optimist or a humanist, whereas so many of today's thinkers are not just nihilists, but really pessimists about human behavior.
Yeah,
And what they
propose
is they propose changing humans rather than changing the world around humans.
That's the left. And then on the right, you get Jordan Peterson, who says, just accept the fact that we're all screwed and we're all gonna be happy. And just do the best that you can, you know, make your bed, stand up straight, and hope that the bolt of lightning hits you and you become happy, because that's what it's going to take. All right. Thanks. Thank you, Jim. Thanks, Jennifer. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you as always.
Thanks to all of you who supported through the super chat and submitted questions. And I will be back, I think tomorrow, 8 p.m. East. Well, either 7 or 8 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow. And then I'll be traveling for the rest of the week. So then again, probably it'll just be on the next Saturday. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, Yaron.
Bye.